Welcome to this next reading in The Bark-Covered House by William Knowlin. This is backwoods Michigan in the 1830s and 40s, and this is a great chapter about, it's titled Chapter 21, How I Hunted and We Paid the Mortgage, and kind of an important part of life in this time period, so thought it's really going to be a fun chapter. So, the mortgage which had hung so long over us, like a dark cloud obscuring our temporal horizon and chilling our hopes, was at last removed May 1st, 1841. After the mortgage was on our place, in the beginning, it seemed as if it were hardly ours. It was becoming more and more valuable all the time, and I thought it was dangerous to let the mortgage run, as the old lady might foreclose at any time and make us trouble and expense. The mortgage was like a cancer eating up our substance, gnawing day and night as it had for years, and I made up my mind, it must be paid. I knew it caused my mother much trouble, and although Father said very little about it, I knew that he would be overjoyed to have it settled up. I told him I thought I had better hunt during one fall and winter, that I thought I could in that way help him raise money to pay the mortgage. I was about 20 years old at the time and thought I had a very good rifle and knew how to use it. I went to my friend William Beale and told him I had concluded to hunt through the winter. I asked him if he didn't want to join me and we would hunt together, at least some of the time. He said he would, and I told him that I thought we could make more money by hunting than we could in any other way, as deer were worth, on the average, from $2.50 to $5 apiece at Detroit. And we could take them very handily on the cars, so the train at the time. We found the deer very numerous in the town of Taylor, next south of the town of Dearborn. Sometimes we went and stayed a week. We stopped nights with an old gentleman whose name was Hodge. He always appeared very glad to see us and gave us a hearty welcome, as he and his old lady at the time lived alone. No doubt they were glad of our company. They must have felt lonesome, and they knew they would be well rewarded with venison and money for the trouble we made them. Mrs. Hodge took as much pains for us and used us as well as a mother could have done. We carried our provisions on our backs, flour, potatoes, pork, whatever we needed. We carried pork for the reason that we relished it better, a part of the time, than we did venison. Mrs. Hodge prepared our meals at any time we wanted them. Sometimes we ate our breakfast before daylight and were a mile or two on the runway of the deer when it became light. The woods and the oak openings abounded in deer, and we had very good luck as a general thing. We made it a rule to stay and not go home until we killed a load, which was not less than 6. And then we went and got Father's oxen and sled to go after and bring them home. After we brought them home, we took the hind quarters, the hide, and sometimes the whole deer to Detroit and sold them. In this way, we got considerable money. In fact, my pocketbook began to pod out a little bit. Of course, we saved enough of the 4 quarters for our family's use and for our old friends Mr. and Mrs. Hodge. But we couldn't afford to let them have the saddles. We wanted them to sell, as we were going in for making money. It would be impossible for me to delineate the occurrences incident to my hunting days. The stories told in full would fill a volume, but if it were not in connection with my father's family and how we got along when I was at home with him, I should not mention it at all. As it is, I will try to describe one day's hunt after deer, which might be called a successful day, and another after bears, which was not successful, or 1 or 2 deer fights. My comrade and I started from Father's house very early one morning. A nice tracking snow, 3 or 4 inches deep, had fallen during the forepart of the night, and in the morning it was warm and pleasant. When we came near the head of the windfall, we found tracks where 3 large bucks had been going along. It was not common that those large deer would go together. They were generally scattered, one or two with other deer, but in this case it seemed 3 old bucks had agreed to go together. We followed them about a half a mile to the west until they crossed what is now the old telegraph road to the town of Taylor, south of where Mr. Putnam lives. We thought the deer went into a large thicket that stands there. We made up our minds they were lying in that thicket. William said he would go around and stand on the ridge beyond the thicket in a good place to see them when they were driven out. I told him I wanted him to be sure and down with one of them so that I could see how they looked. I stood where he left me about half an hour to give him plenty of time to get around, and then started along slowly on the tracks. I followed them 10 or 15 rods when I found that instead of going into the thicket, as we supposed, they had turned into a smaller thicket near a fence and a clearing that had been made in an earlier day. I thought they were lying there, but sure enough, in a minute, they jumped up and away they went, one after the other, toward the big thicket. They seemed desirous of making all the sport of me they could. As they were running across the little opening, they showed me their white flags. I shot very quickly at the middle one. I told him by the report of my rifle, which rang out clear in that morning air, that I wanted him to stop. He struck his flag. They were running from me a little diagonally and were about 25 rods off when my bullet struck his side, it being partly toward me. They ran into the big thicket where we supposed they lay, and I loaded my rifle and went where they were running when I shot. I saw the blood that flew in little particles on the snow, and I was sure he was ours. He ran for one breath and got out of sight and fell dead, having made his last tracks, being shot through the lights. I hurried across to my friend Beale and told him I'd shot a noble buck, and that he was running away from me, and that I would not allow him to do so. The other two had gone out of the thicket and over the ridge, so far east that he couldn't see them at all. We hurried back to where the one that we had got lay, and we took out his entrails, climbed up a sapling, bent down the top, fastened the gambrels of the old buck to it, and then sprinkled powder on his tail so as to keep the ravens from picking him. Let go the sapling. It straightened up with him so that he was out of the way of the dogs and wolves. And then we started as quick as possible after the other two. They went in a southwest direction about 80 rods and then turned southeast and went straight for Indian Hill, went over it, and took their course nearly east. They had ceased to run and were walking. There was another large thicket east of us, which was about a half a mile through, and we thought possibly they might stop in that before they went through into the woods. It was agreed that I should go around, that time, to the lower end of the thicket and stand, and he was to try and drive them through as if they were there. I went south to what we called the south branch of the Reed Creek. It was frozen over, and there were 3 or 4 inches of snow on the ice. I went over it without making any noise, and I ran down a little over half a mile very quickly. When I was below the thicket, I turned north and went through the brush that grew on the side, the bank of the creek, up to a little ridge where it was open, and I stopped by the side of a tree, which was about 20 or 30 rods from where I turned north. I didn't stand there but a short time before I heard and saw some partridges fly away, and I knew they had been disturbed by something in the thicket. When I saw the 2 deer coming straight toward me, as they could, one right after the other. When they got within 8 or 10 rods of me, I had my rifle ready. They saw me, and they went to jump sideways. My rifle spoke to another one, and the voice of it forbade him going any farther. That was the second word my rifle had spoken that morning. The deer turned and ran in a half circle, half around me in plain sight, and then off, out of sight, over the ridge, to where Dr. Snow's farmhouse now stands in the town of Taylor. In a few moments, out came my comrade, and I asked him what the report of my rifle said as it burst through the thicket by him and echoed over the Indian Hill, and he said he thought it spoke luck. and we followed the old buck a little ways over the ridge and came to where he'd made his last jump. He was a beautiful fellow, equally as fine as the first one. Then we thought we had done well enough for one day. Each of us had one, so we cut a little wooden hook, put it into his underjaw. We both took hold and drew him up where the other one hung. We put them together and started slowly for home, and we were following along an old trail that had drawn both deer about a half a mile together when we came to where 5 or 6 deer had just crossed. They were going southeast, we were going northeast. While we were looking at the tracks, 2 men came in sight. One was Mr. Arvin Sheldon, and the other one was Mr. Holden. We knew them very well, and they knew that we were good hunters. They looked at our deer and said that we must hang them up, and said they would help us. So we bent down 2 saplings and hung the deer up side by side, and then we started with them. It was early in the day, perhaps 10 o'clock. We followed the deer beyond what is now Taylor Center and into the west woods 2 miles from there. Near Taylor Center, Holden left us. He thought there were too many of us together, and he went off to try his luck alone and followed another flock. We found that these deer were very shy and seemed impossible for us to get a shot at them. After we got into the west woods, we were bound to stick to the same ones. It was late in the afternoon, and we were getting so far from home that we thought we had better use a little stratagem. We would go very slowly, it was agreed, and that I should follow the tracks, and that the other 2 would be governed by my movements. One was to go on my right and keep as far off as he could and see me through the woods, and he would keep a little ahead of me, and the other one was to manage the same way on my left. When we started, we were something in the shape of a letter V, only more spread. If I went fast, they were to go fast. If I went slowly, they were to do the same, and they were to watch me and look out ahead for deer. We traveled some little distance in this way when I saw a deer standing about 30 rods off. It was a long shot, but I drew up my rifle and fired. Mr. Sheldon had 2 dogs with him, and when I shot, they broke from him and ran after the deer we'd been following. They went yelling after them, out of hearing. It was always my practice after I shot to stand in my tracks and load my rifle, keeping an eye on the place where the deer were. When I shot, my comrades started for me, and soon we were 3 friends together. Sheldon remarked that he guessed that I hadn't hit that one, and I asked him why. He said that the dogs had already gone out of hearing, that if I had killed one, they would have stopped. I left the tracks and walked along in the direction to where the deer stood, watching upon the snow and brush to see if I could see any signs of where the bullet had struck up brush or twig, until I came to the place where the deer had stood. It proved to be not one of those that we had been following, but an old buck who'd just got up out of his bed where he'd been lying and was standing over it when I fired. I looked and saw some short hair lying on the snow and told Mr. Sheldon that it looked as if I had made a square shot and that the dogs had gone after the well ones that we'd been following, and that this one was an old buck which we hadn't disturbed before. I thought perhaps he had got up to see the flock that we were following go by. We didn't follow him more than 10 rods before we found where he lay last. He was a very large buck, a full mate for either of those we already had. A little way back we crossed a coon's track, and we knew that he had been along in the latter part of the night as it snowed in the earlier part of the night, and we thought he hadn't gone far, so we agreed that Sheldon would follow his tracks and find his tree. And at that time, coonskins were very valuable. While we were back about a mile to a lone settler by the name of Plaster, who lived in the opening, and borrowed an axe. When we came back to the woods, we were to halloo, and he was to answer us. We had to do what we did very quickly, as it was getting near night. When we had borrowed the axe and were nearly back in the woods again, we heard the report of Sheldon's rifle as it rang out of the timber, clear and sharp, and died away in the oak openings. When we got into the woods, we hallooed for him, and he answered, and we went to him, and he had found the tree. We asked him what he'd shot at. And he said, at a deer, but he missed him. We cut down the tree and were rewarded by getting 4 coons. Afterwards, I sold the coon skins in Detroit for $1 apiece. Mr. Alvin Sheldon is now an old resident of the town of Taylor and lives about 2 miles southeast of me. After we got the tree cut down and the coons secure, it was between sundown and dark. We were 6 or 7 miles from home, and then we had to take the axe home. And later that evening, when I got back under the old paternal roof, there was one there who was very tired, but the excitement of the day helped him a little by hunting, and it was hard work for me, and I made a business of it. I accumulated a considerable sum of money. Father had earned and saved some money so that with what I had, he made out enough to pay off the mortgage to Mrs. Phillahaven and had it canceled. And then his farm was clear. If I had not felt anxious about it myself, the joy expressed by the other members of the family when they knew that the mortgage was paid would have been sufficient reward for all the labors I performed, for all the weary walks, the running, and the racing done, while upon the chase, both day and night. It is a little singular that an animal as mild and harmless as a deer ordinarily is, should, when cornered or wounded, have such courage that he will fight man or dog in his own defense, jumping upon them, striking him with his feet. As their hooves are sharp, they cut to the quick, and at the same time they're hooking with their horns. I will relate 1 or 2 incidences, one of which came under my own observation. I was out hunting with R. Crandall. We were near the Reed Creek when he shot a buck. The deer fell. Crandall thought he was sure of him. He handed his rifle to me, and I told him to stand still and load his gun, but he ran like an Indian. He took long steps. And when he got up near the old buck, it had gotten a little over its shock, the bullet gave him, and he got up and turned toward Crandall and raised the hair on his back so that it stood forward, and then the scene changed. Crandall ran, and the deer ran after him. He came very near catching Crandall, and must have done if he had not dodged behind a tree. And around it he went, and the deer went after him. And Crandall said he called upon his legs to be true to his body, then, if ever. And I thought, judging from the way those members of his organism were carrying him around that tree, that they were exerting every nerve to save him. He hallooed every minute for me to shoot the deer, but the race was so amusing. I didn't care to hurry, having never seen such an exhibition of Crandall's speed before. Without a doubt, he did his level best. Soon, however, I thought it necessary, and I shot the deer. Crandall said that I laughed enough to kill myself. He appeared to be displeased with me, and said I was too slow, and that I might have released him quicker. Some 2 or 3 years after this, Crandall had another hunt with Mr. Holden of Dearbornville, the incidents of which are given in his own words. Quote, being anxious for a hunt, Holden and myself started out for a deer hunt on our southern hunting ground. After traveling about 3/4 of a mile from Dearbornsville, Holden, being a little away from me, started a buck. And running directly south, I told Holden where to go on a certain road, newly cut out, and stand, and I would drive the deer to him from the east. And as expected, I soon started him, and Holden's dog followed the deer straight to him, and in 3 minutes, whang, went Holden's gun, and I ran with all my might. The dog had stopped barking, and I knew the deer was ours, but when I got to the road, I heard Holden hallooing loudly for help. The deer had jumped across the road into the old treetops, and the dog caught him. Holden saw the deer was getting the better of the dog, and laid down his gun, took out his knife, and went for the deer. When he got up to the deer paid all his attention to him instead of the dog. The deer had gotten Holden down between 2 logs and stood on him, stamping and hooking him desperately. Holden said, "For God's sake, kill him or he'll kill me." As I was so much excited, I was afraid to shoot for fear of killing Holden or the dog, but I shot, and the deer fell lengthwise on Holden, and I rolled him off. And Holden got up all covered with blood from head to foot, with his clothes torn to shreds. And he looked at himself and he said despondently, "What a spectacle I am." I peeled some bark, tied his rags round him, patched him up best I could, and we started for home through the woods, got as near as his home as we could, and not to be seen. When I left him, went to his house, got some clothes, took them back to him, and helped him put them on. And then clothed he went home, a bruised and lacerated man. Pretty exciting deer hunts. I have never had a deer hunt quite anything like that, but wow. Hunting deer for a business, as a cash crop, something we don't think about too much today, but making enough money to help pay off the mortgage that was just so, I don't know, mentally crippling to the family, knowing that it might be taken, their land might be taken from them at any time. Very, very great chapter with a lot of exciting parts to it. And this is some of the best parts of reading journals and memoirs of this time period, where people get excited about telling this part of the story. So it's always a lot of fun. So we'll have fun as we continue to go into chapter 22. Thank you so much for joining me as we read William Knowlin's The Bark-Covered House. It's a joy to go through this book, and every time I read it, there's something new, some little twist. I love this one. It's got lots of great information. I hope you had a good time on this episode today, and I want to thank you for your amazing support for what we do here on Townsends Plus, and thanks for watching today.